Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 69th episode of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean up into 1900. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. And now I would like to thank the Alumni Association of the University of Michigan for sponsoring today's episode. It's my pleasure to introduce and welcome today's guest. Margaret A. Leary is the librarian emerita at the University of Michigan Law School. She was director of the law library from 1984 to 2011. Margaret holds a BA in political science from Cornell University, an MA in library science from the University of Minnesota, an MA in creative writing from Eastern Michigan University, and a JD from the William Mitchell College of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota. Today, Margaret will discuss her book, Giving It All Away, the story of William W. Cook and his Michigan Law Quadrangle. Margaret, we're so delighted to have you on the program. Before you tell us more about the story you unearthed, I would love to hear about what prompted you to embark upon this research and led you to writing this book.
That's a great question. And I actually begin my talk by explaining that. So if you don't mind, I'd like to wait to answer that because it's a question that every author gets asked. And I think I have a nice way of explaining what got me interested.
Great. All right, take it away.
Okay. Oh. Sorry. I'm sorry.
No worries. Yeah, sometimes, especially when you're sharing, sometimes the screen doesn't cooperate the way you want it to.
Yeah, I'm just looking for, I just want to play it from start. Oh, wait, view. There, does that look okay, Angela?
That looks great.
Okay, great. Greetings to all of you, and thank you very much for the chance to enjoy your company, and most important, allow me to indulge my obsession with William W. Cook. But first, a quick alert. This talk, which is based on my book, whose cover you see here, is not strictly chronological. The handout that I hope you have is a strict account of what happened when. It's a page long, and I hope you have it in case you get confused about where we are in time. People often wonder why I wrote this book. And the answer is that back in August of 1973, I became the assistant director of the University of Michigan Law Library. I moved here from Minnesota. It was August, so there were no students and there were no faculty around, so I could fully explore my new surroundings, starting with the large walk-in vault that had housed the law library's rare book collection until it outgrew that space. That vault was now part of my office. So the vault contained unspecified valuables, including, at the time, the hundreds of dollars in coins from the copy machines that students used in the library. But I reasoned there must be more. So I rummaged around. Soon I found a plain cardboard box that was very heavy, had no label on it. What could it be? Gold? It had to be valuable, and I had to find out what was in that box. I opened it, took out the tissue paper, and lifted out a large black head. What or who was it? It looked vaguely familiar, and then I remembered the bust at the east end of the reading room. Later, I learned that there was another one in the Martha Cook building. What I found was a model for that bust made from Cook's death mask. Cook had stubbornly refused to have any photo taken since around 1900. So when he died, a death mask could create a bust to take the place of the photos that he never had taken. Once that mystery was solved, there was a much bigger one. The Legal Research Building, and in fact, the entire Law Quad, which you see here, 4 buildings taking up an entire square block of Central Campus, were named after him. So, who was he? I asked my faculty colleagues, especially the older ones. No one knew much, just that he was, quote, a Michigan law grad who was a corporate lawyer in New York, end quote. They didn't know why he gave money to the law school. A few warned me that he was peculiar and prejudiced, or as the secretary of the university who knew Cook well had put it, Cook was outstandingly philanthropic in his own way, a strange combination of the urbane and the tyrannical, the generous and the suspicious, the dreamer and the dictator in practical matters. This building is another less well-known building done by York and Sawyer, architects of the Martha Cook building, as well as the entire original Law Quadrangle. This is the Chi Psi Fraternity House built in 1915 before any of the Law Quadrangle. And I have not seen this mentioned anywhere in my research, but I thought it was interesting that it was here right across from Hutchins Hall. So people warned me about one of his books, American Institutions and Their Preservation. Here you see its 2nd edition in 2 volumes. It was proof of Cook's prejudices and was hidden away from library users in a locked cage in the law library. My urge to find out more about Cook in 1973 was quickly set aside for other responsibilities. When I did begin the Cook research, Deans Jeff Lehman and then Evan Kamenker encouraged me, and the result was this book. My research led me to many things I had not expected. First of all, it was a terrific story. It included romance, broken hearts, a lot of emotions, drama, the clashing wills of Michigan men, suspense, and several lawsuits. Secondly, it provided Cook's motivation to, quote, give it all away, unquote, to the Michigan Law School. Third, the roots of the University of Michigan's early and strong support from alumni ahead of all other public universities, which is what has made the University of Michigan arguably the preeminent public university. And the fact that Cook never saw a single stone of what he built in Ann Arbor, from the 1915 Martha Cook building to the 1933 completion of the Law Quad. Today, I want to focus not just on the Law Quadrangle, but also on how the Martha Cook building Cook's first gift to the university led to his other gifts. I want to start with Cook's death and a lawsuit that threatened to take half of Cook's estate away from the law school. Could the quad have been twice as big? Let's go back to June 3rd, 1930, a day so hot that people were collapsing on the streets of New York City and dying from the heat. In a worn-down house on 97 acres of beautifully landscaped property in Portchester, New York, Cook lay on a metal bed that had been placed on a worn rug in his living room. He was struggling to breathe. His lungs were weak from a decade of tuberculosis, and he was deeply depressed. Cook's only solace then was knowing that his fortune, then about $12 million, acquired through hard work as a lawyer, a writer, and a shrewd investor, would be spent on what he most valued, the preservation of American institutions, specifically the legal system and democracy, by improving the education of lawyers. Cook was certain that his will ensured that everything would go to the Michigan Law School. The next day, June 4th, as a broiling sun brought New York to its knees, on the hottest day of the year, Cook breathed his last. The next week, the New York Times reported on Cook's will, quoting university officials who said the gift would make the law school, quote, the wealthiest the world has ever known, unquote. I'm sorry to say that was somewhat of an exaggeration. I can well imagine the reaction to Cook's death in Ann Arbor that June. Genuine grief at Cook's death, but also a huge feeling of relief. For years before his death, university administrators had worried that Cook might not, as everyone hoped, give everything to Michigan. They feared that his sour relationship with Law Dean Henry Bates, shown here, who was dean for a long time, would drive Cook away and ruin everything for Michigan. Cook's death and the news of his will had eliminated these concerns. I can also imagine the scene in Ann Arbor 8 months later in early 1931, when Dean Bates learned about the latest development in the much anticipated Cook legacy. A woman who claimed to be Cook's wife was threatening to sue for half of his estate. Cook's wife, Bates would have raged, pulling off his rimless glasses and pushing his wavy hair back from his face. Bates might have said that man lived in abject solitude. He was prickly, prejudiced, peculiar, and stubborn. It's hard to imagine he had a friend, let alone a wife. Where did she come from? This must be a fraud. Well, it wasn't a fraud. Ida Olmsted had married William Cook in 1889 in a Unitarian church in Manhattan. They divorced 9 years later in 1898. Now, 33 years after their divorce, Ida was claiming that the North Dakota divorce was invalid and that New York law entitled her to a spouse's half of the estate. Was Michigan going to lose half of what Cook had willed to the law school? What would happen to the buildings that were then under construction? That is, in 1931, the John P. Cook dorm, the Legal Research Building, aka the Law Library, and Hutchins Hall. Before I disclose the outcome of the will contest, I want to give you context, starting with the highlights of Cook's life. He was born in Hillsdale, Michigan in 1858. His father, John P. Cook, was a founder of the town of Hillsdale and a successful businessman, banker, and lumber mill operator. He was very active in Michigan politics. He was in the legislature, and he was a participant in the 1850 Constitutional Convention. Will was the fourth child of John Cook and his second wife, Martha. His first wife had died, but left 3 children, so Cook grew up in a large family and a confusion of cousins, or were they half siblings? I'm not sure. He lived in a fine house, shown here, surrounded by bountiful gardens, chickens, horses, and cows. The local paper often wrote of parties at the Cook home, describing them as elegant, gracious, and generous. John Cook gave land and money to Hillsdale College, and Will's first philanthropy was to give money to Hillsdale, first for a new boiler, then to refurbish a women's dorm, and finally, and most generously, to found a department of domestic science. But in his philanthropy, it's clear to me that Martha was foremost in his mind. Martha created a loving home for her family, and Will, who as an adult never did have much of a family of his own, created homes first for women at Hillsdale, then at Martha Cook, and later for mostly male law students in the law quadrangle. Cook attended the U of M, earning a bachelor's degree in 1880 and a law degree in 1882. And this is what the law building looked like. This building is long gone. And this is what the library in that first law building looked like, hardly like the one we know now. And this is how that original law building looked after it was expanded in the 1910s to about double its size. Cook almost immediately moved to New York City when he graduated from law school, and he clerked for 2 years with the first great international law firm, Couder Brothers. Then he entered into practice with 2 other lawyers for about 10 years. Meantime, he joined the prestigious Kane Masonic Lodge. His father died in 1884, leaving Cook the resources to do only what he really wanted to do. In 1895, Cook took a big career step. He left his practice to become general counsel to John Mackey's companies, the most important of which were the postal telegraph and the commercial cable. This is the postal telegraph building, and this is the commercial cable building. A very tall building for its time. To understand the next 25 years of Cook's life and his fortune, we need to know about John W. Mackey. He was born in Ireland in 1831, and he went to California and then Nevada in the 1850s, accumulating a huge fortune as one of the richest of the Silver Kings. He so-called retired to New York City in 1882, the same year Cook arrived, and went right back into business, but of a new sort. Mackey, whose Nevada-born wife lived in Europe, was greatly offended by the low quality and the high cost of communications overseas to his wife. He blamed the telegraph and cable monopoly of Jay Gould's Western Union. By 1886, Mackey had broken that monopoly. Over the next 30 years, the Mackey companies were the only real competition to Western Union. William Cook was crucial to the Mackey company's continuing success in challenging the Western Union monopoly and maintaining competition that ensured lower rates and better service. On July 4th, 1903, this photo shows it, President Teddy Roosevelt and Mackey came together at TR's Oyster Bay Retreat on Long Island, where they exchanged eastbound and westbound telegrams and cables that circled the globe in 9 and 12 minutes, respectively. Thus, Cook helped create the first global communication network that ever existed. His major contribution was not his expertise in the technology of telegraph and cable, but his expertise in corporation law. There was, and still is, no national corporation law. Instead, each state wrote its own. The Mackey companies had to establish a presence in literally every state in order to run telegraph lines through them and to establish offices where people could come to do business. This required Cook to learn the law of every state and eventually of Canada and apply it. And look, here is the Postal Telegraph Office in Ann Arbor, which is was at the corner of East Huron and North 4th. And here's what that looked like on the inside. Cook's contributions, excuse me a second, I'm lost. Okay. Cook's contributions as a corporate lawyer were made even more influential because of his scholarship and becoming a leading writer on corporation law. His book, Cook on Corporations, was the major treatise on this core topic from the time of the first edition in 1887 to the last 8th edition in 6 volumes in 1923. Here's what was important about what he did. He moved the focus of corporation law in 2 ways. First, he pioneered the use of the corporation as the legal entity for the emerging large businesses of the Industrial Revolution. Previously, the corporation had been used almost exclusively for nonprofits, such as churches. Secondly, Cook moved the focus from the rights of the corporation as an entity to the rights of the stockholders, the people who invested in the corporation. Together, these set the pattern for the development of modern corporate law. Cook's writings on corporation law are probably the most authoritative source of information on the development of that law from 1887 to 1927, 4 decades. Another of his first books, Trusts, in 1887, provided the Ohio Attorney General, shown here, with new information, the actual text of the Standard Oil Trust agreement. And that led him to bring the first suits against the Standard Oil Trust. That trust agreement had remained secret until Cook found it. This suit drove Standard Oil out of Cleveland into New York. To understand Cook's legacy to the law school, I'm going to shift gears a bit here and notice that Cook filled his personal life with fine architecture and landscaping, as he later did for the University of Michigan. York and Sawyer, the architects of the Martha Cook Building, and then the Law Quadrangle and the fraternity house that we saw across State Street early in this presentation. York and Sawyer designed Cook's Manhattan townhouse built in 1913 at East 71st Street, one building from the Frick Mansion on 5th Avenue. This is a view showing the top of the building adjacent to the Frick Library. And this view shows all 4 floors above ground. It also had a below ground floor. Cook retired in 1920 when he learned he had tuberculosis, and on doctor's orders lived mostly in the better air in Portchester, where he lived in an older house on a very large property. He spent an estimated $50,000 a year for 20 years landscaping that Portchester estate. And as we know, he died in 1930. Now the story of the Martha Cook Building shown on this postcard. This is Cook's first gift to the University of Michigan. By 1910, women at Michigan were agitating to get a dormitory. Students back then lived in boarding or rooming houses, which was a special difficulty for women students. Parents were very worried about their young daughters living in such houses so far from home. In fact, some mothers accompanied their daughters and lived with them here in Ann Arbor. The university didn't yet have a system of dormitories and didn't want them. They feared resentment from the many townies who made a living housing students, and they didn't want to undertake new expenses. Remember, this was still a new university. They had to build classrooms, laboratories, a hospital, libraries, and they had to hire and retain faculty. But the women were insistent, especially one Myrtle White, remember that name, who in 1910, the summer before her senior year, traveled around Michigan trying to raise awareness of the need for a dorm for women and money to build it. This was long before the university had a development office, long before the university had hundreds of staff to raise money and build buildings. Myrtle, shown in the lower right here, graduated, but the regents, and especially President Hutchins, who had succeeded Angel as U of M president, wanted her to go to New York. In 1910, were so many impressed by her that they sent her in January 1911 to call on successful alums in New York City. And guess what? William Cook was one of the most successful that were there. His office was at 44 Wall Street, a building that is still there. She called on him on January 15th, 1911, armed with a set of plans from a Detroit architect for a women's dorm. She very much impressed Cook, who asked many questions. 4 years of living in boarding houses had prepared Myrtle with facts about the advantages dorms would have. Cook said he would support her project and asked Miss White to, quote, have your president call on me. President Hutchins, shown here, did call on Cook, who pledged $10,000 to the dorm project. The fundraising continued. About a year later, Cook got a letter from Hillsdale College asking him to give money for a women's dorm at Hillsdale. Hillsdale suggested that if he did that, they would name the new building after his mother, Martha, who had died only a year and a half earlier in 1909. Cook's response must have deeply disappointed the people at Hillsdale. He could not give money for a dorm, quote, especially as the president of the University of Michigan has called upon me to build a similar building at Ann Arbor at an expense of $150,000, unquote. His original pledge of $10,000 had suddenly grown. No more Cook money would ever go to Hillsdale. Hillsdale's request may have inspired Cook to name the dorm after his mother and explain how his initial $10,000 gift expanded to cover the entire $400,000 that Martha Cook cost. That is, the building and all of its furnishings were bought by Cook. And it opened in the fall of 1915. By the way, Hill Auditorium opened the same year and only cost $300,000. And here is something that women who live in Martha Cook remember lovingly, which is Portia, a sculpture of Portia at the main entrance of the Martha Cook building. This building is still used as a dorm only for women. This is a more contemporary view of the inside of it, which shows you how beautifully it was done, and I'm proud to say how beautifully it's been maintained. President Hutchins wrote to Cook that Martha Cook was a, quote, substantial, dignified, and elegant structure that time will affect but little, end quote. The university held a grand opening dinner in early November that year, followed by a public reception at which Cook's role, once secret, was finally made plain. Before we leave the story of how Cook came to give Michigan the Martha Cook building, I want to tell you about a remarkable piano that's now in the Martha Cook building. And you can see it here. It's an art case Steinway piano. And here is another view of it. This was one of my great research finds, was the probate inventory of every single thing Cook owned at his death, both in his Manhattan townhouse and in his country house in Port Chester. Something very valuable was missing from the probate inventory of his possessions. This custom-made art case Steinway piano delivered to 14 East 71st Street in 1913. The piano is now the centerpiece of the Gold Room in the Martha Cook building. Cook bequeathed the piano to the dorm in his will, and it was promptly shipped to Ann Arbor on his death before the probate inventory was taken. Above the keyboard, in gold lettering, it says 1913, and then in Latin, the phrase, "Music is medicine to the troubled soul." So here's what I already knew. Cook didn't play the piano. He didn't play any other instrument. He had no interest in singing that I could ever uncover. So why would he invest in such a special piano? This was yet another mystery for me to solve. I had heard Cook family rumors of Cook's friendship with a, quote, opera singer, end quote. There were hints the relationship was serious. The woman regularly gave gifts to Cook's nieces. I had hunted high and low for an opera singer who would fit what I knew to no avail. So why the art case piano? Yet another mystery. Here's how I found the answer. William Cook's elegant townhouse at 14 East 71st Street contained a paneled library with a crystal chandelier, a fireplace, and glass-enclosed bookcases filled with books. And this is a photograph of that room. In 1929, as Cook committed to building the Legal Research Building, now known as the Law Library, too, York and Sawyer suggested creating space on the 9th floor of Legal Research, to which Cook's library, paneling, fireplace, books, and all could be moved. Since it was unlikely, given his illness, that he would ever live in the townhouse again, Cook agreed, and it's all still there, just like this. Books and all. Most of the books are what I would call wallpaper books, the ones you can see to the left of the room. But Cook might have marked some of them. So I asked my research assistant to inventory all the books that were in this library and to look for any that Cook might have marked up. This was part of my effort, not to find the opera singer, but to understand the sources and concepts behind Cook's writing. One day she came down to me with an autographed book, Arnold Bennett's The Matador of the Five Towns, at the time a popular short story collection. It was signed Isabel Hauser, Hauser, August 15th, 1912, Cleveland. The only other autographed books in Cook's library were from people I knew were close and important to him, but I had never heard of Isabel Hauser. This was very exciting. I learned that she was not an opera singer. She was a pianist. She was from Cadiz, Ohio, and lived across Central Park in Manhattan in the relatively new and swanky Apthorpe apartments. And this is what they look like now. They are now, of course, condos, taking up the entire block between West 78th and 79th Streets and Broadway and West End Avenue. And this is, her maid lived with her. She did have a maid. And this is what the inside looks like now. Perhaps the relationship with Hauser influenced Cook in his mid-50s to build the townhouse and include the art case piano. Isabel died suddenly and painfully in December 1915, mere weeks after the Martha Cook building opened. Her will revealed she owned many of the same stocks and bonds as Cook. So I feel as if I found the answer to the question about the piano. But again, I've strayed from my story about the will contest. Let's resume. Who was Ida Olmsted Cook, who threatened to sue in 1931 for half of Cook's estate? Ida was the daughter of Dwight Olmsted, a lawyer in New York City who bought and sold land as the Manhattan population moved north, and who single-handedly reformed New York City's land registration system. Ida was beautiful, as you can see, a petite woman with a tiny waist and delicate features, blue eyes, and curly light brown hair. Will and Ida married on February 20th, 1889. He was desperately eager to marry her, and she was desperately anxious about marriage and very reluctant to become his wife because her parents' marriage was not a success. He promised, however, to make her, quote, the brightest, sweetest, happiest wife that ever lived, unquote. That persuaded her. But the marriage wasn't happy. They separated several times and in 1898 were divorced. A chronology of his work for Mackey and his publication shows him to have been a workaholic who couldn't possibly have spared much time for Ida. In winter 1898, Ida took a train to Wahpeton, North Dakota, and filed for divorce. Why North Dakota? For a brief time in the late 1890s, it was the divorce capital of the US. A New York paper ran a large cartoon in 1898 entitled Divorced in One Dakota Day, part of it's shown here, showing a Rube Goldberg-like divorce machine. North Dakota laws offered a quickie divorce. Ida claimed that Cook had deserted her in February of 1894. Cook's response was, no, she deserted me a month earlier. Cook cross-claimed, and the court granted him the divorce. In 1931, Ida's lawyer claimed that the North Dakota court had not had jurisdiction over Ida 33 years earlier because her domicile was not where she was, it was where her husband was. Without jurisdiction over her, the lawyer argued the divorce from Dakota was invalid, making her a widow rather than a divorcee. A New York statute would require that she, a widow, would get half of Cook's estate. Michigan took the claim seriously, hiring lawyers to defend its position should Ida file suit. Ida's claim caught the university at a really difficult time. First of all, Cook's estate was primarily stocks and bonds. No one knew in 1931 when the Depression would end, but the university was scared. Second, the Legal Research Building, the John Cook Dorm, and Hutchins Hall were all under construction. With Cook no longer writing checks because he was dead, the project stalled pending resolution of Ida's claim. Before we learn the outcome of the suit, I'd like to return to the 1920s and describe more clearly the university's situation. The fear that Cook might not give everything to Michigan was rational, based on Cook's soured relationship with Dean Bates. After Cook died, Bates would claim credit for the Cook gift, but President Harry Hutchins is the true hero of this story for his role with Cook when Hutchins was dean of the law school, then president of the university, and later as president emeritus. Hutchins spent the 7 years after the Martha Cook Building opened in 1915 persuading Cook to give a dorm for law students. Cook agreed only in 1922. Hutchins alone knew how to appeal to Cook, certainly not Bates. Now let's learn about the battles between Dean Bates and William Cook. They did hold each other in high mutual regard for their professional accomplishments. Each also expressed negative opinions about the other. Bates felt that Cook was peculiar, even savage. Cook said that Bates had, quote, certain personal peculiarities which precluded him from being a good administrator. Regent Walter Sawyer, trying to ease the tension, wrote to each man to urge patience with the childishness of the other. Here is Walter Sawyer, U of M regent for a long time. He was 3 years younger than Cook and long a leading citizen of Hillsdale. He was another key person in the story of Cook's gift. He had a U of M degree in homeopathy and practiced in Hillsdale his whole life. He served as a UM regent from 1905 until his death in 1931, the entire period of the Cook gift saga. His knowledge of the Cook family psychology helped the university navigate around Cook's prickly, quirky personality. His knowledge of Bates helped too, as illustrated by the pair of "Be Patient with Childishness" letters shows. Both Bates and Cook wanted the law school to have better students, better faculty, and to produce more research to improve the law. But unfortunately, they just couldn't get along. Today, we would say they had a control problem, a control issue. During the 7 years from 1924, when the Lawyers Club opened, until 1931, when the John Cook Dorm and Legal Research opened, law students occupied gracious new dorm rooms and ate in the elegant dining room of the Lawyers Club. All that time, the school made do with classrooms, faculty offices, and a library in the old 1863/1910 law building near the corner of North U and South and State Street. See the contrast in the next slides. Here is the Lawyers Club dining room as it appeared in the 1940s. I believe this is the Judge Advocate General's Corps, which was based at the law school during World War II. But look how wonderful that is. Here is what it looks like now, still very nice. Here is the lounge in the Lawyers Club. This photo was taken about 1925. It's still much the same, except for having new furniture. It's used for many events, from talks to retirement dinners to just a place for students to read. To again remind you the difference, here is the law library in the old law building as it was used until 1931. The New York Times, in Cook's donor status to the Lawyers Club, was not revealed until it opened in 1924, 100 years ago. From 1922, when Cook committed to build the Lawyers Club, until early 1929, the university was never certain that Cook would give anything more than the Lawyers Club. 7 years. During that time, Bates became more and more anxious, and his anxiety built, his behavior worsened. For example, he maneuvered to get 2 offers from Harvard Law's Dean Roscoe Pound, trying to use those job offers to get the regents to push Cook, but the regents refused. So these are the 3 big gaps in Cook's giving. The first is the gap between Martha Cook opening and Cook's agreement to build the Lawyers Club. The second came after the Lawyers Club opened. The final gap resulted from Cook's death in 1930 and Ida's threat to sue for her half of his estate. The final problem was that Cook relied heavily on 1910 Michigan law grad John Creighton, shown here, who wormed his way into Cook's life and was named trustee of Cook's estate. Bates disliked and mistrusted Creighton, calling him a, quote, toad, unquote, who is, quote, smoother than all of us and not in this for his health, end quote. So when the Lawyers Club was done in 1924, Cook refused to divulge whether or when he would pay for anything else. This drove Bates nuts. Cook often quoted Emerson, quote, "A man of the world performs much and promiseth not at all," unquote. And Cook wrote to then President Burton, "In regard to the dean's reference to a law school building, I was not aware that anyone had promised to erect such a building." Cook so disliked Bates that in May 1925, right after 6 months after the Lawyers Club opened, Cook announced that he would no longer tolerate any communication with Bates of any kind. So the years 1925, 1926, 1927, and most of 1928 passed slowly and painfully by. The main reason for Cook's inaction was probably the terrible relationship with Bates. A second reason for Cook's delay, of course, he was sick with TB since 1920 and may not have felt up to the role he played in designing the buildings, which was very enormous. A third reason, Cook was writing American Institutions and Their Preservation, which came out in 1927. Cook did a second edition in 2 volumes in 1929 and was working on a third edition at his death. This book is certainly the source of the idea that he was prejudiced. In 1927, the relatively new president, Clarence Cook Little, terribly worried that Bates would decamp to Harvard, which had just made him a new offer. But the regents were unperturbed. They were used to Bates and his threats to leave the university. The regents told Little, "This is just the first time he's threatened to leave during your presidency. He's not serious." In late 1928, Bates persuaded Little that between the Michigan legislature and Bates' private fundraising skills, notice there was no evidence that either of these was possible, that money could be raised for the law school buildings. Bates persuaded Little to recommend that the regents do that and inform Cook that the regents were doing so and that they were not going to wait any longer for Cook's money. For the regents, this was just the latest on a long list of examples of Little's poor judgment. They held a secret meeting in December 1928. Afterward, they told Little that his idea was terrible and that they had lost all trust in him. Little's subsequent letter of resignation cites as his first reason for leaving his, quote, inability to deal with private donors in a manner consistent with policies the regents deemed wise, end quote. He resigned effective June of 1929. Hutchins appeared at the January 1929 Regents meeting with a letter from Cook affirming his commitment to build the Legal Research Building. Later that same year, Cook committed to build the John Cook dorm and last Hutchins Hall, the, quote, law building, end quote, that Bates had wanted to come first was actually last. Now we see the 1931 lawsuit in context and better understand the anxiety in Ann Arbor. 3 buildings were under construction and the value of the estate was dropping as the Depression worsened. But even worse, in 1931, lawyer William Gibbs McAdoo contacted the university about his client. His client claimed to be Cook's widow. She threatened to sue to claim half of Cook's estate. Were she to win, the university would be unable to complete the buildings that had just been started in 1929 and 30. At first, the university wasn't concerned. They had found divorce papers in Cook's safe and thought that would be good enough. But the regents became concerned when the highly regarded and well-connected McAdoo came on the scene. As you can see, he was a US senator for several years. So the university wanted to negotiate, but Ida was in California and the university was at a disadvantage because they knew nothing about her circumstances. Was she hale and hearty and of sufficient means to endure a long and expensive lawsuit? Or was she old, weak, tired, and poor, and willing to settle for relatively little? No one knew. Not at any rate knew Ida's circumstances until Myrtle White. Remember, the young woman who had called on Cook back in the early part of the 20th century, the first contact with Cook back in 1911, stepped back into the picture. She was living near LA, but as a loyal alum, often returned to Ann Arbor. In late 1931, she visited again and learned about the dire situation with the Cook estate. She learned Ida's long Los Angeles address and quickly found that a friend who taught at UCLA annually arranged a trip to England for her students. One student, Beatrice Borst, wanted to go but could not afford the trip. But she hoped her aunt, who lived with her, might come into an inheritance to pay for the trip. The aunt was Mrs. Ida Cook. Soon the university learned that Ida was indeed poor and in bad health and settled with her a few weeks later for $160,000. And what became of Ida? Amazingly, she moved to Ann Arbor in the late 1930s and died in St. Joe's Hospital in 1942. She lived for a couple of years in the Union near the completed quad where she could pass by Cook's gift daily. Later, she lived in the Anbury apartments on East University, shown here in this photo. These are now long gone and were replaced by a very tall student-filled apartment. Do you recall Cook's eagerness to marry and Ida's reluctance? Ironically, for the rest of her life, Ida called herself Mrs. William W. Cook, even on her gravestone, shown here. But Cook, when asked in the census or for a social directory, never described himself as divorced. He always chose the word single. Cook never saw the buildings on the University of Michigan campus that he had poured his heart, soul, and fortune into. Although he regularly visited Hillsdale, he never returned to Ann Arbor after he graduated from law school in 1882. He told Regent Sawyer that he did not want to ruin his dream. He told others that he did not want to be pestered by people asking him for more money. That would be Bates, right? And of course, when he died, only the Lawyers Club had been completed, so he could never have seen it all. I return to 2 points I made at the beginning: Cook's motives for giving everything to Michigan and his role in fostering U of M's support from alumni. Cook expressed his motives in his will. First, he believed that, quote, American institutions are of more consequence than the wealth or power of the country, end quote, and that the legal profession could preserve and develop those institutions, and that by improving the Michigan Law School, he would improve the character of the legal profession and help to preserve American institutions. Second, Cook wanted his gift to, quote, cause others to realize that the university can no longer be extended in its main development by state taxation alone, end quote, and that others, quote, should be generous in their financial support. That university is and should be the pride of the state of Michigan. So to wind this up, Cook did achieve his goals, even though he didn't live to enjoy knowing that he did. We have a gorgeous law quadrangle and a beautiful women's dormitory. He provided buildings named after his parents, Martha and John, across Tappan Street from each other, and money to the University of Michigan Law School, not only to build all those buildings, but a significant fee to support faculty research, which is still being used. And finally, an excellent legal education for new lawyers. Now, if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them or comments on this.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and I definitely learned some new things. So before we get to questions, I would just like to share my screen and do a couple of wrap up slides. And I will just say, want to let everybody know that our current exhibit, co-curated with students from winter film studies class, Living Photography, Finding Film History in the Archive, is available through actually the end of August now. And so you can come see that in person Monday through Friday from noon to 4, and you can also view it online. And once again, I'd really like to thank the Alumni Association of the University of Michigan for supporting this program and for being such good partners in getting the word out there. I know that many of you heard about this talk through the Alumni Association, and we really appreciate you tuning in and participating. And if you're so inclined to make a gift to the Clements Library, especially to help support our programs, you can contact me to sponsor a future episode of the Bookworm. And in any case, we appreciate your wonderful participation and asking such great questions. And we enjoy very much seeing you on the third Friday for the Bookworms. So yes, we have some good questions, and including I just find it so fascinating to think about how Mr. Clements was interacting with all of these people that you're mentioning, because of course he was also a donor to the university and was also a regent during this time. So was certainly talking about the gift and the dean of the law school. And so just wondering if you have any thoughts about if and how they might have interacted.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up. And you mentioned that to me earlier, and so I did look into it. My initial response was that it was very unlikely that they had met, because Cook never came back to Ann Arbor after he graduated from law school in 1882. And because Clements lived in Michigan, it was probably, if they were to have met, it might have been in Ann Arbor. But Cook never came back to Ann Arbor. I did look into it though, and discovered that they were to be seated together at a table at a wonderful Michigan event that I believe was held in about 1911. Angela, I sent you some if you remember. It was around 1911.
Right.
And here's what the occasion was. The occasion was for Michigan alumni who could make it to Manhattan to celebrate the fact that the University of Michigan had more members of Congress than any other college or university in the country at that time. And Cook and Clements were, the program listed them as sitting at the same table. Now, they were big tables of 10, but still it was the same table. What I don't know is that Cook was there or that Clements was there. So they may well have sat together. I don't know. That was the only thing I could find about that. But since the gifts were so close together in time, Clements was actually finished earlier than Cook's, but still, I do also think, and I can't remember where I got this impression, but I also think that the location of the Clements Library affected the selection of the place to put the Law Quadrangle, and the presence of the Martha Cook Building, which opened in 1915, might have influenced the location of the Clements Library, because it's possible that, I mean, donors are always, no, it's possible that donors would compete with each other in the sense of both wanting to give equally wonderful things to the university. And so that then might have led, certainly the presence of Martha Cook on one side of the street facilitated the presence of the Law Quadrangle on the other. But I think the presence of the Clements Library there, and of course the president's house was there too. So this was both the Clements Library and the Martha Cook and the Law Quadrangle all benefited from being together in those places. So whether or not they actually met, I never found evidence of it, and I looked more recently, but I never, Angela, I have to confess, until you asked me that question the other week, it hadn't occurred to me to look into it. So,
Right. Well, of
yeah.
course not. I mean, why?
So that's
Yeah.
part of the wonderful thing about doing a talk like this. I always learn something.
Right. Right. Well, and I do think it's not unthinkable that someone's paths and time can intersect in this way, but yet there's no direct evidence
Right.
of exactly how, because Yeah, so that it's really interesting to know that if nothing else, they're kind of going along
Mhm,
parallel to each
mhm.
other
Right,
anyway.
right.
Um, so yeah, and certainly made that part of campus very beautiful. We love,
Mhm, mhm.
being right across from Martha Cook
Right, right.
and kitty corner from the law quadrangle.
Mhm,
Um, yeah, so some of these interactions that you talked about, I mean, I definitely had moments of, oh my gosh, it really is an interesting story of love and fighting and
mhm.
intrigue. Especially seeing Ida's tombstone at the end and just thinking, huh, who would have thought?
Yep, yep. Well, yeah, it's, the whole thing was very, very interesting. And what I often say is that when I embarked on the project at first, I had no way of knowing that I would discover all this wonderful stuff. I could well have found a lawyer who worked for a private firm in New York, became very wealthy, but because he worked for a private firm, none of what he did was available. Nobody wrote about it. There's no record of it. He lived in Scarsdale and died on the golf course at 70. And that was that. But luckily for me, well, if it had been like that, I wouldn't have done anything further. I couldn't have known more, but I was just very lucky that it. But what still astounds me is that in 1973, nobody on the faculty knew anything about Cook, except that he had written this book that they had to hide. And if I
Right.
might say something more about that book, American Institutions and Their Preservation, it's actually modeled after de Tocqueville's book. And the book is full of it basically it's an array of uh, the value of individual I won't even say races, nationalities to come to the US. And it starts with England and then I don't know, maybe Ireland and then on down. And as you work down lower on the on the list of desirability, the darker the skin gets. And uh, and so when people look at that book now, they think it's horrible. But here's the thing. In 1920, the US Census revealed that the population in the South had gone down and the population in the North had gone up. And the Constitution requires that after each decennial census, the congressional districts get redrawn to reflect the population change. What the 1920 census revealed was that if they were to do that, the power would shift to the north away from the south. And it also revealed the huge number of people that had come into this country through 1920 from other countries. And that was number one, that constitutional requirement that the congressional districts be withdrawn was never met. They stayed the same all the way through the 1920s. Secondly, people were so alarmed to see all these people coming from other countries that they passed the first laws restricting people coming from particular countries. And that still remains an issue today in a different way. But it was just fascinating to me to discover that about the 1920 census, something which, by the way, well, I can't go into that. It's a different subject. Anyway,
Right,
thank you
right,
for
right.
letting me say that.
No worries. Yeah, so that is interesting. But then you also mentioned talking to some family members, right?
Yeah, yes.
So they knew about him, and so how did you find him and who were they?
It's just another example of the luck of the Irish. Um, I had a student, when I was working, I taught in what was then the library school, and I taught a course in law librarianship. And one of my students was a woman named Martha Campos, but Martha's middle name was Cook. And it turned out that Martha Cook is a sort of great grand niece of William Cook. And I found that out just by accident, but I found it out pretty early in my career. And she became, even though she doesn't have a law degree, she became a very successful law librarian working for oil firms in the library of oil firms. And because she became a law librarian, we would see each other at annual meetings of the American Association of Law Libraries. And so we stayed in touch. And when I got interested in writing this book, she said, oh, she could help a lot. And she told me about a woman who was like her aunt or her great aunt who lived in Grosse Pointe. And she connected me to that woman. And that woman, who has since died, provided me a huge amount of information. And I'll just give you one example. I would go over, she was housebound to her first floor because of a stroke she had, but she had a 2-story house. And I would go over there, and she liked to have corned beef, sandwiches, and beer. So I would go to the local deli and get some sandwiches and beer, and we would have lunch together. And she would then say, now, Margaret, if you have time and you would like to, you could go up to the 2nd floor, and in the dresser that's on the left side in the top drawer, there's a lot of Cook papers, including his mother, Martha Cook's diary.
Oh.
So every time I went, I would go through there and I would take notes, or I would take photographs or whatever, including reading Martha Cook's diary, which had some interesting stuff in it. And she told me more and more. She had actually met William Cook. She didn't remember much about him, but he became famous in the family, of course, because of what he did. And so that was a really fantastic connection. So that helped a lot. Those are the two, Martha, my colleague, and then her aunt in Grosse Pointe. And Anne Cook was a great traveler. And the family would have a special event every Christmas time, where they had a certain kind of punch that they drank. And for several years, they invited me to that, which took place at Anne's house. So I met even more of Cook's relatives that way.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, it was.
Through that, did you encounter any information that you didn't put in the book that you wish you could have?
No. If I hadn't had those connections, there's a lot that I wouldn't have found out, because one thing leads to another. I did, I hesitate a little bit to say this, but the fact that Cook, I wondered for a while about Cook's, I don't know what else to put it, sexual preferences, but I finally decided there's no way I can know, and it doesn't matter. And so I actually sent a draft of the book to a couple of people, a couple of men I know who are in a position to determine something about, have an opinion about that. And they both said, you just can't tell, drop it. Because I had put speculation, and I just erased all that out. It doesn't matter. But I felt so good when I found out about the pianist, because that explained the piano, and that explained a lot of things. And the fact that she died explains why there was never more of her in Cook's life, because she died. So it really helps to show a draft to people who are willing to read it. And I also have to say, my copy editor was a local person whose name is Penny Schreiber. And she really, really contributed to the book being readable. I had a whole chapter on how they put the cable under the Pacific, which I researched for a month or two. And Penny came over to my house to review that chapter with me. And I said, what did you think of that? It was so hard to find out. How could they put a cable in 1900 under the Pacific, which is so deep and so cold and so rocky? And she said, it doesn't matter. The chapter has to go. I said, but I worked so hard on it. And she said, good. That means you can summarize it in a short paragraph. And I said, well, can I have 2? And she said, well, okay, you can have 2 paragraphs. So, a good editor helps a lot.
Right. It's easy to get in the weeds sometimes, especially with some of those interesting things that are tangentially related to your story.
Mhm.
But but maybe not instrumental to the story.
You haven't asked about this, but I can't resist saying it. When I was researching the piano, it was right around the time that the Martha Cook building had had that actual piano redone, fixed up by somebody from the School of Music. And I met him, and he said that he'd been to the Steinway factory and that Cook had had several other pianos just like that made. So I thought, oh my God, where did those go? So
Right.
I went to the Steinway factory, and they were wonderful to me. They showed me all their records, and I only had a day to spend, and I couldn't find any record of another piano like that being made for Cook. So I finally decided, as far as I know, there was just one, and I'm not going to go into it anymore, but it was fun to go there.
Oh, I bet it was.
Yeah, and it
Yes.
was a very, very special piano. I mean, in the book, I have a much longer description than I bothered with today, but it's just an example. Also, I could never have written this book without the Bentley Historical Library,
Right.
because so many of the papers of the regents are there, the papers of deans are there, the papers of faculty members, many, I just could not have done it. In fact, when the Bentley got a new director a year or so ago, I gave her a copy of my book.
Oh,
Not
good.
because I expected her to read it, because I wanted her to see that this is an example of research and writing that could never be done without the Bentley's collection. And I'm sure that's true many times over for the Clements Library as well. Just very special places that just have information that can't be found anywhere else.
Yes, yes, definitely. Thank
Mm.
you.
Yep.
So I guess one more question, because, as you described it, I was envisioning the $50,000 spent on landscaping every year at the
Yeah.
Portchester, is that where you
Yeah.
said it was,
Yeah.
place? So what happened to that house and those grounds?
Oh, that's kind of it's a long, and in some cases, sad story. Part of the property, right around the time Cook died, part of the property was taken by the state to put a parkway through, and I can't remember the name of the parkway. So part of it was gone, but it was more than 100 acres. It was really big. And Cook gave it to a hospital in New York. I think it was the Presbyterian Hospital. And he gave them all of the land, and they built a building on it that they used for some purpose, but it really wasn't a very useful place for them to have a lot of land. And it was conditioned on them, their ownership of it was conditioned on their using it for the hospital. And after probably into about maybe 1950, they used it, but then they sold it. And when they sold it, of course, to the people who could pay the most for it. And I've gone back there a couple of times, and the uses to which that property has been put are astounding. For one thing, there's a condo development, townhouse type thing that must be 100 units in it. There's a high school and a sport field for the high school. There's a junior high with the same. And there are some offices for the local township or something like that. And everything that Cook did is pretty much gone. The house is gone. All the beautiful trees that he put there are gone. He had a horse, and he used to ride his horse around so that he could easily see all the trees that he had planted. And he had some unusual things there, but I've found a photograph of a stone wall around it, which was designed by, I think, Samuel Parsons. But anyway, it's nothing like it was. And I could not really find out much about what it looked like. I couldn't find any information about what the house was actually like, other than that it was kind of shabby and old. Because once he decided, and he did decide that he wanted to give, I don't have any proof, but I believe that he decided he wanted to give all of those buildings to Michigan fairly early, because he worked with the architects on designing them. And he had a lot to say about how they were designed, in very detail, the kind of stone it is and the kind of slope of a roof and so on. And he just He just really wanted that property in Portchester to stay like it was, but that's impossible to do. You just can't do it. Yeah.
Right, right. It truly is. And um, if you think about it, even while someone's alive, they're thinking about the property in a
Mhm.
particular way and they see it day to day, but he was even changing it that whole time.
Oh,
So it's
he was improving it. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So yeah, it's hard for those things to stay at,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah, yeah.
in time. But well, this has been amazing. So thank you so much. We very much enjoyed
I love doing it.
hearing more.
Thank you for asking me.
You're welcome. All right. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks
Thank
so much.
you. Same to you.
Bye.
Cheerio. Bye-bye.